You are nothing but an illiterate servant. Do not speak to me until you learn to read proper English." The silence that followed those words was deafening. It wasn't just a quiet room. It was the kind of silence that sucked the air out of the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan. Forks froze mid-air. A waiter 3 tables away stopped pouring a vintage Cabernet. Everyone stared at the woman in the crimson Valentino dress who had just screamed at the young waitress. But they were looking at the wrong person. Because the waitress, Casey, didn't cry. She didn't run. She didn't apologize. Instead, she reached into her apron, pulled out a fountain pen, and did something that would cost the billionaire's wife her reputation, her marriage, and her entire social standing before dessert was even served. To understand why the crash was so loud, you have to understand the height from which the fall began. Casey Miller was invisible. That was the job description. At Le Chateau, a French restaurant nestled on East 61st Street between Park and Madison, the waitstaff were expected to be silent ghosts in pressed white linens. They were there to ensure that the water glasses of the Upper East Side's elite never dipped below the halfway mark, and that the crumbs of their brioche rolls vanished before they hit the tablecloth. Casey was good at being invisible. It was how she survived. At 26, she was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Her shift started at 4 p.m. and ended at 2 a.m., 6 days a week. During the day, she wasn't Casey the waitress. She was Casey Miller, a doctoral candidate at Columbia University, finalizing a dissertation on archaic contract law and linguistic nuances in post-war treaties. She spoke 4 languages fluently and could read 2 dead ones. But in New York City, a PhD didn't pay the rent, and it certainly didn't pay for her mother's dialysis treatments back in Ohio. So, she poured the wine. She folded the napkins. She endured. It was a Tuesday in November, the kind of rainy, miserable New York night that made the rich feel even richer because they were dry and warm inside. The restaurant was buzzing. The maître d', a nervous Frenchman named Claude, was sweating through his suit. "Table 4 is yours." "Casey," Claude hissed, shoving a leather-bound wine list into her hands. "The Hightowers. Be careful." She sent back the water last time because the ice cubes weren't square. Casey's stomach tightened. Everyone in the hospitality industry knew the Hightowers. Or rather, they knew Cynthia Hightower. Her husband, Preston Hightower, was a hedge fund manager, quiet, brooding, and worth roughly $4 billion. He was the money. Cynthia was the noise. She was his second wife, 20 years his junior, a former catalog model who wore her insecurity like a weapon. She was terrified of not belonging, so she made sure everyone else felt like they didn't belong either. Casey took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and walked toward the corner booth. They looked like a portrait of misery. Preston was thumbing through emails on his BlackBerry, ignoring the room. Cynthia was staring at her reflection in the back of a spoon, checking her lip liner. She was wearing a dress that likely cost more than Casey's entire student loan debt, a blood-red designer piece that clashed with the velvet banquette. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Hightower," Casey said, her voice steady. "Practiced. Welcome back to Le Chateau. My name is Casey, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some sparkling water, or perhaps a cocktail?" Preston didn't look up. "Scotch. Neat. 30 years if you have it." Cynthia snapped the spoon down. She turned her eyes on Casey. They were cold, scanning Casey from her messy bun down to her sensible work shoes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated judgment. "I don't want sparkling," Cynthia said, her voice nasally and loud. "I want still, but I want it from a glass bottle, not plastic. I can taste the plastic and make sure it's room temperature. If there is condensation on the glass, I will send it back. Of course, Mrs. Hightower," Casey said. "Room temperature, Evian, glass bottle. And bring the menus," Cynthia snapped, waving a manicured hand as if shooing a fly. "The real menus, not the tourist ones." There were no tourist menus. There was just the menu. But Casey nodded obediently. Right away. The trouble started 10 minutes later. When Casey returned with the drink's perfectly room-temperature water for Cynthia, a 30-year Glengoyne for Preston, she placed the menus down. Le Chateau prided itself on authenticity. The menu was written entirely in French, with English descriptions in smaller, italicized font beneath. Casey stood back, hands clasped behind her back, waiting. Cynthia squinted at the menu. The candlelight was dim romantic for some, frustrating for those who refused to wear reading glasses because they thought it made them look old. Cynthia was visibly struggling. She shifted in her seat. She held the menu close, then far away. "Preston," she hissed. Preston grunted, typing a reply to an email. "Preston, put the phone away," she demanded, though she kept her voice low. "I don't know what this is. What is Ristevo? Is it veal I don't eat, baby cows? Preston, it's barbaric." Preston didn't look up. "Ask the girl?" "Cynthia." Cynthia's jaw tightened. She hated asking for help. To her, asking a server for clarification was an admission of defeat. It leveled the playing field, and Cynthia Hightower did not play on level fields. She looked up at Casey, a fake, tight smile plastered on her face. "Tell me," Cynthia said, pointing a sharp fingernail at the entree section. "This dish here, the coq au vin. Is it roasted or fried? I'm on a keto cleanse. I cannot have breading." Casey leaned in slightly, polite and helpful. "Actually, Mrs. Hightower, coq au vin is a classic braised dish. It's chicken, slowly cooked in red wine with mushrooms and lardons. There is no breading, but the sauce is thickened with a roux, which does contain flour." Cynthia's eyes narrowed. She felt foolish. She pointed to another line. "Fine. What about this, the gratin dauphinois? Is that the fish?" The dolphin fish. Casey blinked. She tried hard to keep her expression neutral. It was a common mistake, but the arrogance made it harder to forgive. "No, ma'am," Casey said softly. Gratin dauphinois is a potato dish. It's sliced potatoes baked in cream and garlic. It's a side dish, actually. Cynthia's face flushed a deep, angry pink. She slammed the leather menu shut. The sound echoed through the quiet dining room. Heads turned. "Why is this menu so complicated?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why can't you people just write chicken or potatoes? Why do you have to use these pretentious words to trick people, I assure you? Mrs. Hightower." "We aren't trying to trick anyone," Casey said, her voice remaining calm, which only seemed to infuriate Cynthia more. "It is a French restaurant. The terms are standard culinary French." Standard Cynthia laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "You think you're smart, don't you? Standing there in your little apron, correcting me. You think because you memorized a few fancy words you're better than me. I didn't say that. Mum, I was just answering You were being condescending." Cynthia shrieked. Preston finally looked up. He looked bored. "Cynthia, lower your voice." "No." She turned on her husband. "This little waitress is mocking me. Preston, She's treating me like I'm stupid. She whipped her head back to Casey. I know what you are. I see you. You're a nobody. You're an uneducated little girl who probably dropped out of high school to carry plates for a living. The room was silent now. The ambient music seemed to fade away. The couple at the next table, the CEO of a major publishing house and his mistress, were watching intently. Casey felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her ground. Mrs. Hightower, I can assure you I am educated. Now, if you'd like some more time with the menu, I don't need time. Cynthia stood up. She was tall, looming over Casey in her heels. I need a server who speaks English. Look at you. You probably can't even read this menu yourself. Can you? You just memorized the spiel. That's it. Cynthia grabbed the menu from the table and shoved it toward Casey's chest. Read it. Cynthia sneered. Go on. Read the bottom line. The disclaimer about the allergies. Read it out loud. Casey looked at the menu, then at Cynthia. Mum, please. She can't, Cynthia announced to the room, throwing her arms out. She's illiterate. We are paying $500 a plate to be served by an illiterate peasant who can't even read the warning labels. This is unsafe. It's disgusting. She leaned into Casey's face, her perfume overpowering and cloying. You are nothing but an illiterate servant, Cynthia hissed, enunciating every syllable. Do not speak to me until you learn to read proper English. Get out of my sight and send me someone who has actually finished the 8th grade. Casey stood there. She felt the eyes of 50 people boring into her. She saw Claude, the manager, rushing over with a look of terror, ready to apologize, ready to comp the meal, ready to throw Casey under the bus to appease the billionaire's wife. But something in Casey snapped. It wasn't a violent snap. It was a quiet, cold, decisive click. The part of her that was Casey the waitress, the submissive, invisible ghost died in that moment. And Casey Miller, the doctoral candidate, the scholar, the woman who had spent the last 6 years deciphering the most complex legal texts in human history, stepped forward. She didn't retreat. She didn't look for Claude. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket. She didn't pull out a notepad. She pulled out a Mont Blanc fountain pen, a gift from her late father. The only thing of value she owned. She took the menu from Cynthia's hand. She didn't tremble. She placed it gently on the table. Mrs. Hightower, Casey said. Her voice was no longer the soft, service industry voice. It was deeper, resonant, the voice of someone who had lectured in lecture halls. You are concerned about my literacy. That is a valid concern regarding the safety of your food. So, let's test it. She flipped the menu over to the back, where the wine list ended, and a block of text described the history of the restaurant. But Casey didn't read that. She grabbed a linen napkin, smoothed it out on the table, and uncapped her pen. The ink was dark blue. Since you are so worried about reading, Casey said, staring directly into Cynthia's eyes, I think we should discuss the document I saw sticking out of your husband's briefcase when you sat down, the one you were trying so hard to ignore while you checked your lipstick. Cynthia froze. Excuse me. Preston Hightower's eyes narrowed. He looked at the briefcase sitting on the banquette next to him. A sliver of a document was visible. It was a standard non-disclosure agreement. Or so it seemed. Casey began to write on the napkin. She wrote fast, her cursive elegant and sharp. I have a photographic memory. Mrs. Hightower. It's a curse, really. But it comes in handy when studying ancient dialects or legal contracts. She finished writing and spun the napkin around so Cynthia could see it. "You called me illiterate," Casey said, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "But I just transcribed the first paragraph of the divorce petition your husband has been drafting for the last 3 weeks. The one he has right there in his bag. The one that stipulates that if you cause a public scene within 6 months of the filing, your settlement is reduced by 80%. The air left the room. Cynthia's face went white. She looked at the napkin, then at the briefcase, then at her husband. Preston Hightower sat very still. He looked at the waitress, then he looked at his wife. Slowly, a small, terrifying smile spread across his face. "She's right, Cynthia," Preston said, his voice calm and deadly. "It's called the bad behavior clause, and you just triggered it." The silence in Le Chateau was no longer heavy. It was brittle. It felt as though if anyone dropped a fork, the entire room would shatter like cheap glass. Cynthia Hightower stared at the napkin. The blue ink was bleeding slightly into the linen, but the words were unmistakable. Subsection 4, Paragraph B, Spousal Conduct and Public Reputation Clause. Her hands began to shake, not the delicate tremor of a damsel in distress, but the violent shudder of someone realizing the ground beneath them was actually a trapdoor. She looked at Preston. Her husband wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Casey, and for the first time in years, there was a spark of genuine interest in his tired, grey eyes. "You're lying," Cynthia whispered, her voice cracking. She looked around the room, desperate for an ally. "She's lying. She's making it up, Preston. Tell them she's crazy, Preston." Hightower took a slow sip of his 30-year-old scotch. He set the glass down with a soft clink. She quoted it verbatim. "Cynthia," Preston said. His voice was low, but in the dead silence of the restaurant, it carried like a gunshot. "I drafted that clause myself this morning. I haven't even sent it to my lawyers yet. It's been in my briefcase the entire time." He turned his gaze to Casey. "You read it upside down." From across the table while pouring wine, Casey didn't back down. The adrenaline was pumping through her veins, making her fingertips tingle, but her face remained a mask of professional calm. The font was Garamond, 12-point. The document was sticking out about 3 inches. It was hard to miss when I was placing the bread basket. "You little spy," Cynthia screeched. She grabbed her water glass, the one Casey had carefully replaced to ensure no condensation, and hurled the contents at Casey. Water splashed across Casey's white uniform, soaking her apron. A gasp ripped through the dining room. At table 7, the wife of a senator stood up, hand over her mouth. Cynthia grabbed the empty bottle by the neck, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "I will have your job. I will have you arrested. You violated my privacy. You sit down." "Cynthia." Preston didn't shout. He didn't have to. The command was absolute. "You have caused a scene," Preston continued, checking his watch as if he were timing a boiling egg. "You have assaulted a member of the staff, and you have done it in front of—" He glanced around the room, nodding politely to the senator's wife and the publishing CEO, "in front of half the board of the Metropolitan Museum." Cynthia froze. She looked around. She saw the phones. People weren't just watching anymore. They were recording. The red recording lights of 3 different iPhones were pointed directly at her. "The clause is triggered," Preston said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. 80% reduction. You just cost yourself roughly $75 million. "Cynthia, congratulations. That's the most expensive glass of water in history." Cynthia's knees gave out. She slumped back into the velvet banquette, her mouth opening and closing like the fish she had refused to order. Claude, the manager, finally broke his paralysis. He rushed over, a towel in hand, looking like he was about to faint. "Monsieur Hightower, I am so sorry. Casey, go to the kitchen immediately. You are finished. Get out." Casey nodded, her face burning with humiliation despite her victory. She turned to leave. "Stay right there." Preston barked. Claude froze. Casey stopped. Preston reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He unscrewed a gold pen, a real one. Heavy and expensive. He wrote quickly, tore the check out, and placed it on the table next to the napkin Casey had written on. "For the dry cleaning," Preston said to Casey, "and for the entertainment." He looked at Claude. "If you fire her, I will buy this building, evict this restaurant, and turn it into a parking garage for my interns. Do you understand me?" Claude turned a shade of pale, usually reserved for dead bodies. "Yes, Monsieur Hightower. Absolutely. She is Employee of the Month." Preston turned back to his wife, who was now sobbing quietly, her mascara running down her cheeks in black rivulets. "My driver is outside." Preston said to her, "Take the car to the Hamptons' house. Do not speak to the press. Do not post on Instagram. My lawyers will call you in the morning." "Preston, please," she wailed, reaching for his hand. He pulled away. "You called her illiterate. Cynthia. You tried to humiliate a working woman because you felt small. You proved exactly who you are. And I'm done paying for it." Preston walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Cynthia sat there for a moment, the ruin of her life echoing in the whispers of the room, before she grabbed her purse and ran out the door, shielding her face from the diners. Casey stood there, water dripping from her apron onto her shoes. The room was quiet for one more second. Then, slowly, the senator's wife at table 7 began to clap. Then the CEO. Then the tourists in the corner. Within 10 seconds, the entire restaurant was giving the soaking wet waitress a standing ovation. Casey didn't smile. She just felt tired. She looked at the check Preston had left on the table. It was for $10,000. The adrenaline crash hit Casey about an hour later. She was in the locker room, changing out of her wet uniform. Her hands were shaking now. The reality of what she had done was setting in. She had insulted a billionaire's wife. She had read private legal documents. She had caused a divorce. $10,000. The check sat on the bench next to her cheap canvas tote bag. It was enough to pay for 3 months of her mother's dialysis. It was a lifeline, but it also felt like blood money. "Casey." She jumped. Claude was standing in the doorway of the locker room. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked terrified. "There is a car outside for you," he said, wringing his hands. "A car," Casey frowned. "I take the subway." "Claude." "It's a Bentley," Claude whispered. "The driver says he is waiting for the scholar." "That is you." No, Casey's stomach dropped. Preston Hightower hadn't just left. He had waited, or sent someone back. She grabbed her bag, shoved the check into her pocket, and walked out the back alley exit. Sure enough, a sleek black Bentley was idling next to the dumpster that smelled of old seafood. The back window rolled down. Preston Hightower was sitting there. He had changed his tie. He was reading a file on a tablet. "Get in." "Casey," he said, not looking up. "I'm going home." "Mr. Hightower," Casey said, clutching her bag. "I have class in the morning. Columbia University," Preston said, reading from the tablet. "PhD, candidate, specializing in international contract law, 4.0, GPA, undergraduate degree from Georgetown on a full academic scholarship, fluent in French, German, Italian, and Latin. Currently writing a dissertation on linguistic ambiguity in post-war reparation agreements." He looked up, the streetlights reflected in his eyes. "You're overqualified to serve soup, Casey. The soup pays the rent," she shot back, "and the dialysis bills." Preston paused. He tapped the screen of his tablet. "Yes, Mary Miller. Stage 4 renal failure. Treatment costs are roughly $4,000 a month out of pocket because her insurance deemed it pre-existing. That's a heavy load for a waitress." Casey stepped back, anger flaring in her chest. "You investigated me. In an hour I have resources, and I don't like mysteries. You are a mystery." He opened the car door from the inside. "Get in. I'm not going to hit on you. I'm not going to propose to you. I have a business proposition. 5 minutes. If you say no, the driver will take you home to Queens." Casey hesitated. She thought of her mother, sitting in that dialysis chair, her skin grey and papery. She thought of the stack of final notice bills on her kitchen table. She got in the car. The interior smelled of leather and peppermint. It was quiet, sealed off from the noise of New York. "What do you want?" Casey asked. Preston turned to face her. "My wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, was right about one thing. I am surrounded by idiots. Highly paid, well-educated idiots." He handed her a folder. It was thick, stamped with the logo of Hightower Holdings. "I am in the middle of a merger with a German manufacturing firm. It's a $4 billion deal. My legal team, 20 lawyers from the best firm in the city, have been reviewing the contracts for 2 weeks. They say it's clean. They say it's ready to sign tomorrow." Casey looked at the folder. And my gut says they're missing something." Preston said, "But I can't find it. I don't read German legalese." "You do." He leaned forward. "You read a divorce contract upside down in dim lighting and found a loophole in 10 seconds. I want you to look at this merger." "Tonight?" Casey laughed. A dry, humorless sound. "Mr. Hightower, I am a graduate student. I am not a corporate lawyer. If I give you legal advice, I could be disbarred before I even take the bar." "I'm not asking for legal advice," Preston said. "I'm asking for a translation, a linguistic analysis. I want to know if the words say what my lawyers think they say. And if I refuse, then you go home. You cash your $10,000 check. You struggle for another 2 years until you get your doctorate. And then you beg for a tenure-track position at a mid-tier university. And if I do it," Preston pulled a pen from his pocket. He wrote a figure on the back of the folder. $50,000, consulting fee, for 1 night's work, payable immediately, cash, wire, crypto. I don't care." Casey stared at the number. $50,000. That was a year of treatments for her mum. That was her student loans. That was freedom. She looked at Preston. He wasn't looking at her with pity or lust. He was looking at her like she was a tool, a weapon he wanted to use. And strangely, that was the most respectful thing anyone had done to her in years. "I need coffee," Casey said, "black, and a highlighter." Preston smiled. It was the first time the smile reached his eyes. "Drive," he told the driver. The offices of Hightower Holdings were on the 40th floor of a glass monolith in Midtown. At 100 a.m., the city below was asleep. but the boardroom was wide open. Casey felt ridiculous. She was still wearing her black waitress pants and her sensible shoes. Though she had swapped the wet white shirt for a grey cashmere sweater, Preston had his assistant pull from an emergency wardrobe in his office. Inside the boardroom, 4 men sat around a table that cost more than Casey's childhood home. They were in suits that hadn't wrinkled despite the late hour. These were the partners of Sterling and Finch, the most aggressive law firm in New York. When Preston walked in with Casey, the atmosphere shifted from serious to confused. "Preston," said the lead lawyer, a man named Bradley Thorne. He had slicked back silver hair and a tan that screamed, "I spend my weekends in St. Bart's." "We were just finalizing the liability waivers. Who is?" This Bradley looked at Casey like she was the cleaning lady who had gotten lost. "This is my independent consultant," Preston said, pulling out a chair for Casey at the head of the table. "She's going to review the German addendums." Bradley chuckled. It was a condescending sound. "Preston, with all due respect, we have 3 native German speakers on our team in Berlin. We've vetted the documents. Who is she? Which firm is she with? She's with the firm of none of your damn business," Preston said, sitting down. "Give her the files." Bradley hesitated, then slid a thick stack of documents across the mahogany table. He smirked at his colleagues. They were amused. They thought the billionaire was having an eccentric breakdown. Casey ignored them. She put on her reading glasses, cheap drugstore frames, and opened the first document. The room went silent, save for the ticking of a clock and the aggressive scratching of Casey's highlighter. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Bradley checked his watch. "Preston, really? We have a signing ceremony at 9 a.m. This is a waste of time. The girl is clearly just reading for show." Casey didn't look up. "The term Verbindlichkeiten," she said aloud. Bradley blinked. "Excuse me." Casey looked up. Her eyes were sharp behind the lenses. "In section 12, paragraph 4, you've translated Verbindlichkeiten as current liabilities. That is the standard translation," Bradley said. Annoyed, "It refers to the debts the company currently owes." "In standard business German?" "Yes," Casey said. She flipped a page. "But this contract stipulates that the jurisdiction for arbitration is Zurich, Switzerland. Under Swiss cantonal law, specifically in the context of heavy manufacturing, which this company does, Verbindlichkeiten carries a broader scope. It includes legacy liabilities, specifically environmental pension debts." She turned the document around and pointed to a footnote in tiny print. This footnote refers to a factory in Düsseldorf that closed in 1998. If you sign this, knowing that Verbindlichkeiten covers legacy debts, you aren't just buying their assets. You are assuming liability for 40 years of toxic waste cleanup that they haven't paid for yet. The room went deathly still. Bradley's tan seemed to fade. He grabbed the document. That's a stretch. That's an archaic interpretation. It's the interpretation a Swiss court will use," Casey said calmly. "I wrote a paper on it last semester. The case law is Meyer versus Canton of Zurich, 2014. If you sign this, Mr. Hightower, you are inheriting a toxic cleanup bill that is estimated at..." She did a quick calculation in the margin, roughly 300 million euros. Preston Hightower looked at Bradley. His expression was terrifyingly blank. "Bradley," Preston said softly. "Is she right?" Bradley was sweating now. He was furiously typing on his laptop, searching the case law. His colleagues were scrambling through their own files after a long, agonizing minute. Bradley stopped typing. He looked up, his face pale. "There is a precedent," Bradley stammered. "It's obscure. We didn't think it applied here." "You didn't think," Preston repeated. He stood up and walked over to Casey. He looked at the paper, then at her. 300 million euros, Preston said. "You just saved me nearly $500 million. He turned to the lawyers. "Get out! Preston, we can fix this. We can draft a rider." Bradley pleaded. "Get out!" Preston roared. The lawyers scrambled. Files were shoved into bags. Laptops were snapped shut. Within 30 seconds, the boardroom was empty, save for Casey and the billionaire. Preston walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. He took a deep breath. "You're not going back to the restaurant." "Casey," he said. Casey capped her highlighter. She felt exhausted. But for the first time in her life, she felt powerful. Truly powerful. "I have a shift tomorrow at 4, she said. "No, you don't," Preston said, turning around. "I'm firing your manager. In fact, I'm buying the restaurant. I'll turn it into a staff cafeteria." He walked back to the table and sat opposite her. "My chief of staff just resigned. Or rather, I fired him last week because he couldn't spell. The job pays $250,000 a year, plus bonuses, plus full medical for you and your immediate family. No deductible." Casey stopped breathing. Full medical. No deductible. That meant her mother's dialysis, her medications, everything. It would be covered. "I can't be your chief of staff," Casey said softly. "I have to finish my PhD, finish it at night, finish it in my office." "I don't care," Preston said. "I need someone who can read the fine print. Casey, I need someone who sees what everyone else misses. I need you." He extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Casey looked at his hand. It was the hand of a man who moved mountains, a man who destroyed lives like Cynthia's and saved lives like hers, all with the stroke of a pen. She thought of the customers snapping their fingers at her. She thought of the aching in her feet. She thought of the fear in her mother's eyes every time a bill arrived. Casey Miller reached out and shook the billionaire's hand. "Deal," she said. But Casey didn't know that the deal she just made was about to put her in the crosshairs of something much more dangerous than a divorce or a merger. Because Cynthia Hightower wasn't just gone. She was plotting. And she wasn't alone. 3 months later, Casey Miller was unrecognizable. Gone were the sensible shoes and the messy bun. She wore tailored suits, navy blue, charcoal, and ivory that fit her like armor. She walked through the marble corridors of Hightower Holdings not as a ghost, but as a force of nature. As Preston's chief of staff, she had reorganized the entire executive workflow. She had caught 3 more bad contracts, saving the company millions. She had fired the lazy, the incompetent, and the corrupt. The board members who had initially sneered at the waitress now stood up when she entered the room. But the best part wasn't the clothes or the respect. It was her mother. Mary Miller was no longer grey and fading. She was in a private room at Mount Sinai, receiving the best care money could buy. The dialysis was working. A kidney donor match had been found, and the surgery was scheduled for next week. For the first time in 5 years, Casey slept without the crushing weight of impending grief on her chest. But happiness, in Casey's world, was often the calm before a hurricane. It started on a Tuesday, exactly like the night at the restaurant. Casey was in her office, reviewing the final press release for the German merger, the deal that had started it all. Her assistant, a bright young man named Leo, knocked on the door. He looked pale. "Casey," he said, his voice trembling. "You need to see the news. Channel 4. Now." Casey grabbed the remote and turned on the wall-mounted TV. There, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court of New York, was Cynthia Hightower. She looked devastatingly beautiful in black, wearing a veil like a grieving widow, though her husband was very much alive. Next to her was Bradley Thorne, the lawyer Preston had fired the night he hired Casey. Reporters were shoving microphones in their faces. "Mrs. Hightower," a reporter yelled. "Is it true? Was the divorce a setup?" Cynthia dabbed her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I am a victim." She sobbed into the microphones. "I was cast aside for a younger woman. A woman who manipulated my husband. A woman who is a fraud." Bradley Thorne stepped forward, his silver hair gleaming. "We have evidence," he announced, his voice smooth as oil, "that Miss Casey Miller is not a scholar. She is a corporate spy. She falsified the translation of the German contracts to panic Mr. Hightower into firing his loyal legal team, meaning me, and hiring her. She has been funneling confidential trade secrets to a rival firm in Berlin ever since." Casey dropped her pen. "We are filing a lawsuit today," Bradley continued, holding up a thick file, "for fraud, corporate espionage, and alienation of affection. We have the emails. We have the proof. Casey Miller isn't a hero. She's a con artist." The screen flashed to a blurry photo of Casey from her waitressing days, looking tired and disheveled, next to a photo of her now, looking powerful. The headline beneath read, "From apron to assets, the waitress who stole a billionaire." Casey's phone began to ring, then her office line, then her cell again. It was a cacophony of noise. The door to her office burst open. It wasn't Preston. It was the head of security. "Miss Miller," he said, his face grim. "I have orders to escort you out of the building. Your access has been revoked pending an internal investigation." What Casey stood up. "This is insane. You know me. Frank, you know I didn't do this." "Mr. Hightower's orders," Frank said, looking away. "I'm sorry. Casey, please hand over your badge and your laptop." Casey felt the blood drain from her face. Preston, he believed them. After everything. After the late nights, the trust, the shared victories. He believed the lie. She handed over her badge. She took her coat. She walked out of the office she had built into a command center, past the staring eyes of the employees she had led. She took the elevator down alone. When she stepped onto the sidewalk, the paparazzi were already there. They swarmed her like sharks, flashing bulbs blinding her. "Casey, did you fake the translation? How much are the Germans paying you? Is it true you were sleeping with Preston before the divorce?" Casey pushed through them, her head down, tears stinging her eyes. She hailed a cab and gave the address of her old apartment in Queens. She couldn't go to the hospital. She couldn't let her mother see her like this. She sat on her old, lumpy mattress, staring at the wall. It was over. The dream was over. She was back to being nothing. But as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Casey's eyes drifted to her bookshelf, to the rows of heavy, leather-bound books on linguistics, syntax, and forensic document analysis. She remembered Cynthia's face on the TV, the smugness. She remembered Bradley Thorne's confident smile. "We have the emails," he had said. Casey sat up. She wiped her face. If they had emails, they had text. And if they had text, they had language. Casey Miller stood up. She walked to her desk and opened her personal laptop, the battered one she had written her thesis on. "You want to play word games with me?" she whispered to the empty room. "Okay. Cynthia. Let's play." The boardroom of Hightower Holdings was packed 3 days later. It was an emergency shareholder meeting called by Bradley Thorne, who was representing a group of concerned investors alongside Cynthia. Preston Hightower sat at the head of the table. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. He hadn't shaved. His eyes were hollow. "This is a tragedy," Bradley was saying, pacing the room like a tiger. He projected a slide onto the massive screen. It showed a series of emails, seemingly from Casey's company account to a German competitor named Kraftwerk Industries. "As you can see," Bradley said, pointing to the highlighted text, "Miss Miller explicitly offers to tank the merger in exchange for €2 million. The timestamps match the night she was hired. She played us all. Cynthia sat in the corner, wearing a modest grey suit, looking the picture of the grieving, betrayed wife. She caught Preston's eye and gave him a sad, pitying smile. "I just want what's best for the company." "Preston," she said softly, "I forgive you for being tricked." She was very convincing. The shareholders were murmuring. It looked bad. It looked fatal. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Preston Hightower," Bradley announced, "and the immediate reinstatement of myself as general counsel to clean up this mess." "Seconded," said a fat man at the end of the table, one of Bradley's golf buddies. Preston didn't speak. He looked defeated. He reached for his water glass. Bam! The double doors of the boardroom flew open. Security guards rushed forward, but they stopped when they saw who it was. Casey Miller walked in. She wasn't wearing a suit. She was wearing her old waitress uniform from Le Chateau, the black pants, the white shirt, the apron. Her hair was in a messy bun. She held a stack of papers in one hand and her Mont Blanc pen in the other. "You can't be here," Bradley shouted. "Security arrest this woman. I am a shareholder," Casey announced, her voice ringing clear and bell-like across the room. "Or have you forgotten? Mr. Hightower, part of my compensation package included 0.5% equity in the firm. I have a right to speak." Preston looked up. A flicker of life returned to his eyes. He waved the guards away. "Let her speak," Preston said. Casey walked to the front of the room. She stood next to the screen, displaying the damning emails. She looked small next to the towering projection. But she felt giant. "Mr. Thorne claims these emails prove I am a spy," Casey said. Addressing the room, "He claims I wrote them to a contact in Berlin named Hans Gruber, very original name, by the way, at Kraftwerk Industries." She turned to Bradley. "You provided these printouts, correct? They are the smoking gun. They are authentic." Bradley sneered. "Verified by IT forensics. Verified by your paid experts," Casey corrected. "But there is one thing you forgot to verify. The grammar." The room went silent. "Grammar?" Cynthia scoffed. "Oh, give it up, you little the German language." Casey interrupted, her voice gaining volume, underwent a major orthographic reform in 1996. The Rechtschreib reform. It changed the way certain words were spelled and how punctuation was used. Casey took her pen and walked to the screen. She circled a word in the projected email. "Das." "This word," Casey said, tapping the screen. "Das." Starting in 1996, this spelling became obsolete. It was replaced by das with a double S. No native German speaker under the age of 50 uses the esset, that funny little B shape, in this context anymore, especially not a corporate executive in 2026. She turned to the board. I am 26 years old. I learned German in 2018. I have never used the spelling das in my life. It would be like a modern American teenager writing "thou art" in a text message. Bradley's face twitched. A typo. It proves nothing. Does it? Casey pulled a paper from her stack. I did some digging. Who does use that spelling older generations? Specifically, people who learned German before 1996. People like Bradley Thorne, who studied abroad in Munich in 1985. She slammed a second paper onto the table. This is a subpoenaed copy of Bradley Thorne's college transcripts. He failed German 101 twice, but the third time, he passed. And his final paper, it's riddled with this exact spelling error. He overuses the esset. Casey spun around to face Cynthia. And you, she said. You weren't smart enough to write the German, but you were arrogant enough to use your own burner phone. Casey held up a final document. This is a log from the Le Chateau Wi-Fi router from the night of the incident. My friend Claude, the manager you tried to get fired, gave it to me. It shows a device named Cynthia's iPhone, uploading a 500 megabyte file to a secure server owned by Thorne Legal Partners. Casey dropped the papers on the table. They landed with a heavy thud. I didn't steal the company secrets. Preston, Casey said, looking at the billionaire. She did. She stole the merger data while she was sitting at the table. 5 minutes before, she called me illiterate. She sent it to Bradley to hold as leverage in the divorce. When that failed, they used it to frame me. The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye turned to Cynthia Hightower. Cynthia stood up, her face a mask of panic. It's a lie. She's twisting words. She's just a waitress. Yes, Casey said, smoothing her apron. I am a waitress, and my job is to serve people exactly what they deserve. The police arrived 10 minutes later. It turns out, corporate espionage and fabricating evidence are felonies. As Cynthia was led out in handcuffs, screaming that her dress was vintage and the officers were hurting her wrists, she locked eyes with Casey one last time. There was no arrogance left, only fear. Bradley Thorne was less vocal. He wept as he was led away, blubbering about a plea deal. When the room cleared, only Preston and Casey remained. The projection screen was still humming. Preston stood up. He walked over to Casey. He looked at her apron, then at her face. I thought you betrayed me, he said, his voice rough. I let them take your badge. I didn't fight for you. No, Casey said honestly. You didn't. You looked at the evidence, and you made a logical calculation. That's what you do. That's why you're a billionaire. She took a step back. I quit. Preston. Preston looked stunned. What, Casey? No. I'll double your salary. I'll give you 5% equity. It's not about the money, she said. I saved your company. Again, I cleared my name. But I realized something when I was sitting in my apartment in Queens. She smiled, and this time it was a genuine, warm smile. I don't want to be a corporate shark. I don't want to fight people like Cynthia and Bradley for the rest of my life. I want to teach. I want to finish my dissertation. I want to read dead languages that are beautiful and honest, not contracts that are full of traps. Preston stared at her for a long moment. Then, he nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his checkbook, the same one he had used that first night. You're right, he said. You're too good for this place. He wrote a check and handed it to her. Casey looked at it. It wasn't for $50,000. It was for $5 million. Scholarship fund, Preston said, for the university, on the condition that they give you immediate tenure the day you graduate, and a little extra for a house for your mother, somewhere with a garden. Casey's eyes filled with tears. Preston, go, he said gently. Go be invisible again. But this time, be invisible because you want to be, not because you have to be. 6 months later, Professor Casey Miller stood at the podium of the lecture hall at Columbia University. The room was packed. Students were sitting in the aisles. Language, Casey said, her voice echoing in the hall, is power. It is the weapon of the weak against the strong. It is the key that unlocks chains. She looked out at the sea of young faces. In the front row, an older woman with healthy, glowing skin sat smiling her mother. Next to her sat a man in a very expensive suit, checking his watch but listening intently, Preston Hightower. Never let anyone tell you that your words don't matter, Casey said, closing her book. And never, ever let anyone tell you that you can't read the fine print. The class erupted in applause. Casey Miller smiled, capped her Mont Blanc pen, and walked off the stage. She had finally served her last shift. And that is the story of how one illiterate waitress took down an empire with nothing but a fountain pen and a knowledge of German grammar. It's a reminder that true intelligence isn't about what you wear or how much money you have. It's about what you know and how you use it. Cynthia Hightower thought she could crush Casey because she looked like a servant. But she forgot the golden rule of life. The person serving your food hears everything, sees everything, and sometimes knows more than you ever will. Casey's story proves that when you underestimate the quiet ones, you're usually the one who ends up making the loudest noise when you fall. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were above you? I want to hear your story in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We post dramatic tales of revenge, romance, and redemption every single week. Thanks for watching. And remember, read the fine print.